Gambling for resurrection. Leaders who are weakened domestically often undertake risky policies to avoid undesirable developments for them personally. The fear of removal from office due to poor performance or bad luck may prompt a leader to instigate a diversionary war they may not have rationally started, in the hope that should it go well, he or she would stay in power. Gambling for resurrection can also consist of a leader prolonging an existing war that should rationally end, fearing removal from office or punishment. The Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands was seen as a distraction from President Leopold Galtieri's domestic problems, and an attempt to unify the country in its territorial claim over the islands. After a decisive defeat, Galtieri was ousted the same year. Adolf Hitler refused to surrender at the end of the Second World War, when defeat was inevitable and surrender was in the best interests of Germany. Partially at least, he must have kept fighting because he knew his life was at stake. The invasion of Ukraine is the biggest blunder of Vladimir Putin's career, and the biggest geopolitical disaster and human catastrophe since World War II. In order to salvage the situation, the president appears to be all in. Looking at leaders like Putin and Stalin who use an iron fist to stop any dissent, it can seem almost inconceivable that they could be removed. You would be forgiven for thinking that coup d'états only happen in banana republics and have more or less been phased out in the modern world. 2021 showed us otherwise. Donald Trump's refusal to concede to Joe Biden after losing the presidential election was the first non-peaceful transition of power in US in at least 220 years. Not exactly a military intervention, but several officials described it as a coup. Then there was a major successful coup led by the military of Myanmar, and there were also coups in Armenia, Nigeria, Jordan, Mali, Kabul, Guinea, and Sudan. While not exactly the kinds of places we associate with stability, I would not describe any of these as banana republics. But a coup in the Kremlin, that just feels almost impossible, right? With the exception of the turbulent years during the collapse of the Soviet Union, one thing which has held remarkably firm in the Kremlin is its leadership. However, there have been a number of coups that are rarely discussed because of their relative success. Contrary to expectations, successful military coups are mostly bloodless. Intelligent plotters typically don't launch if they believe there's a real chance it'll come down to a shootout in the presidential palace, or tanks rolling down the main streets. That in itself is a failure. Instead, they must ensure they have majority support from the armed forces in the capital, or at least can convince everyone that they do, before any moves are made. Yeltsin's confrontation with the Supreme Soviet in '93, which ended only after Russian tanks fired on the parliament building, is the closest thing to a coup in modern Russia. And it wasn't quite a coup, but rather a standoff between two opposing branches of the government. And the result of the coup was relatively democratic. Yeltsin's Russia was a far more free place where people still had the opportunity to freely voice their concerns and protest. To find a true analog to Putin's Russia, we need to look back at Stalin, who used ruthless oppression to maintain his power. He targeted his closest comrades, humiliating them or setting them off against each other. It seems almost inconceivable that the Soviet Party elite tolerated such a tyrant as head. Yet they did, mostly out of the fear of their own lives. After the Great Purge, there was no one left to stand in Stalin's way. Having this man in power was dangerous to say the least, but as it turned out, plotting against him was even riskier. Failure would have meant certain death, and only death itself ended his reign. Putin has certainly been taking notes. None of Stalin's replacements came even close to having such an iron grip. His immediate replacement was Lavrentiy Beria, the longest-lived and most influential of Stalin's secret police chiefs. He was essentially the first to lead the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. He was removed by Khrushchev and Prime Minister Georgy Malenkov, who, after gaining the approval of the Presidium, the main governing body, removed Beria from power in June 1953. After being arrested, he was tried for treason in a mock court, sentenced to death, and executed. A successful coup. He was replaced by Khrushchev, who himself was ousted in October 1964, when Leonid Brezhnev took advantage of growing annoyance in the party with Khrushchev's endless bureaucratic changes and lack of progress. While Khrushchev was vacationing in Abkhazia, he was urgently recalled to Moscow. After his arrest, his Presidium colleagues presented him with a list of complaints and called on him to resign. Khrushchev did not offer a fight and peacefully accepted his removal, another successful coup.
The Reds say ill health prompted Khrushchev to step down. Observers say that his abortive feud with Red China that broke apart the front of monolithic communism was the real reason.
Could we see another successful coup in the current climate? One thing is certain, Putin will not go like Khrushchev, but it seems unlikely he has as much of a hold on things as Stalin. Considering the events in Ukraine, it now appears that Putin has no option but to remain in power until his death, or else be arrested and put away for the remainder of his life. So the prolonging of the war in Ukraine is now seen by many as Putin's attempt of self-preservation. Putin has done a good job of what political scientists call Coop Proofing. He has spread counterintelligence officers throughout the military, making it hard for potential mutineers to know who to trust. He has delegated responsibility for repression to security agents other than the regular military, which physically distances the military from Moscow and reduces the incentive to rebel. In 2016, Putin created the Russian National Guard, an entity separate from the military. It performs internal security tasks like border security and counterterrorism in conjunction with Russia's intelligence services. These services are split into 4 federal branches: the FSB, GRU, SVR. The fourth is the Federal Protection Services. It's essentially Russia's Secret Service equivalent, with a twist. It has in the range of 20,000 officers. That is about 3 times more manpower than the Secret Service of the United States. This allows the Federal Protection Services to function as a shield that can protect Putin from assassins and coups. The result is that the regular military does not dominate Russia's internal security landscape. Any successful plot would require complex coordination amongst members of different agencies who may not know or trust each other. Each day the war drags on. Russia grows more isolated, increasingly dependent on China to keep its trade balance afloat. Russia's failure to take Kiev and its recent reversals in eastern Ukraine have led even Putin's supporters to question his decisions. There's a limit to people's patience. With each day, it seems more and more plausible that someone in the Kremlin may decide it's time for this to end. And then we will see if Putin is more like Stalin or a Khrushchev.
But Joseph Stalin knows that to protect all of his power, he must be increasingly ruthless. Over the years, he has made many new enemies within the Kremlin. It is time now to do something about them.
I firmly believe that we should be embracing Russians who are trying to escape their regime, rather than locking them in. Watch this video next to find out why. Now, many thanks to my super amazing and long-term Patreons. I wouldn't be producing content without you. Geo Perspective, out.